Welcome back, my dear friends. And to anyone joining me for the very first time, the night has been waiting for you. The second story has just arrived at our new home, Infinite Darkness, and it may be the darkest one yet. For those of you who followed me here after the first tale, thank you. You are the reason this journey continues, and I promise you the stories are only going to get better, deeper, and far more terrifying. Everything you have been waiting for in the silent hours of the night now lives in one place, and one place only, Infinite Darkness, shown right here on your screen. This channel you are watching now is being left behind, so if you want to stay with me, there is only one way forward. Go to Infinite Darkness, subscribe, turn on the bell so the darkness can find you the moment a new story drops. Then dim the lights and let yourself fall in. The second story is already waiting for you, and it knows you are coming. I volunteered for this assignment. That thought repeated in my mind like a mantra as Daniel and I fought our way through the maze of fallen timber blocking what used to be a trail. Fresh graduates from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, we'd spent 4 years studying these mountains, learning their ecology, their weather patterns, their hidden dangers. We thought we understood the Adirondacks. We were wrong. The Five Ponds wilderness stretched before us, over 100,000 acres of untamed forest where cell towers were fantasy, and the nearest road lay 15 miles behind us. The veterans at the ranger station in Wanakina had watched us sign the volunteer sheet with expressions I couldn't quite read. Not concern exactly, more like recognition, like they were seeing ghosts of themselves, younger and more naive, before something had taught them better. Your assignment is simple, Station Chief Morrison had said, spreading a topographical map across his desk. His finger traced a route to a small marking in the northeast section. Bear Mountain Lookout Tower. Last inspection was 2017. We need someone to assess structural integrity of the tower and check the old ranger cabin at the base. Document any damage, note if it's salvageable or if we should remove it from the maps entirely. He'd paused then, glancing at his deputy, a grizzled woman named Stevens who'd worked these woods for 30 years. She'd said nothing, just studied us with eyes that had seen too much. You'll be out there 3 days, Morrison continued. 2 days hiking in, 1 night at the site, 2 days back. Weather's stable, should be straightforward. Should be. Those 2 words carried weight. I didn't recognize until later. Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, I understood why the older rangers had exchanged those looks. The forest here felt wrong. Not dangerous in the obvious ways, no fresh bear tracks, no signs of territorial predators. It was something subtler, something that made my forestry training feel inadequate. The silence was too complete. No birds called from the branches, no squirrels chattered warnings at our passage, just the crunch of our boots through crusted snow, and the rasp of our breathing in the January cold. "Hold up," Daniel called from behind me. He was doubled over, hands on his knees, face flushed red against the white landscape. "This trail is worse than they said. We've crossed 4 blowdown areas in the last mile. The 2021 ice storm probably took out half the old-growth pines," I said. Though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't quite right. The damage pattern was strange. Trees hadn't just fallen. They'd been twisted, snapped at odd angles as if something massive had moved through the forest with deliberate force. We pressed forward. The temperature was dropping fast. That particular Adirondack cold that seeps through every layer of clothing and settles into your bones. My breath crystallized on my beard. Ice formed on my glasses, forcing me to stop repeatedly to clear my vision. Each time I paused, I found myself scanning the tree line, though I couldn't have said what I was looking for. The tower appeared suddenly through a break in the pines. One moment we were surrounded by forest. The next we stood in a small clearing, staring up at a skeletal structure of rust-eaten steel. The lookout tower rose 60 feet, its metal framework twisted and sagging, the enclosed observation cabin at the top listing dangerously to one side. The access ladder was missing several rungs. The whole structure groaned softly in the wind, a sound like distant screaming. "Well," Daniel said quietly, "that's coming down, no question." Beneath the tower squatted the ranger cabin, a log structure with a corrugated metal roof weighted down by decades of accumulated snow and ice. One wall bulged inward, the logs rotted and failing. The windows were dark, the glass intact but so filthy they appeared black. The chimney pipe hung at an angle, disconnected from the roof, pointing accusingly at the sky. We approached slowly. Something about the cabin's appearance triggered my training. The way the door hung slightly open, the fresh scratches on the frame, The disturbed snow near the entrance that looked almost like something had been dragged, but dragged in or out I couldn't tell. "You seeing this?" I asked Daniel, pointing to the marks. He nodded, his jaw tight. "Probably deer. They shelter in abandoned buildings sometimes during harsh winters." "Right," I agreed, but neither of us moved closer. The wind picked up, howling through the tower's framework with an almost vocal quality. For a moment it sounded like words, like someone calling from far away. I shook my head, clearing the thought. Acoustic tricks, nothing more. Wind in metal, the same phenomenon that makes people hear voices in old houses. "Let's get inside before we lose the light entirely," Daniel said, forcing cheer into his voice. I grabbed the cabin door and pulled. It resisted, swollen with moisture and age, then gave way with a shriek of rusted hinges. The smell that rolled out made us both step back. Decay, mildew, something else underneath that I couldn't identify. Animal musk, maybe. The sharp tang of old urine. Daniel clicked on his flashlight, and we stepped inside. The cabin's interior was worse than the exterior suggested. Our flashlight beams revealed a single room, perhaps 15 feet square, with bunk beds along one wall, a cast-iron stove in the corner, and a small table with 2 chairs near what had been a window. The glass was still intact, but grime and frost made it opaque. The floorboards were warped and buckled, water damage evident everywhere. The ceiling sagged, yellow stains marking where rain and snow had penetrated. But it was the details that made my skin crawl. The lower bunk's mattress had been shredded, its stuffing scattered across the floor in clumps mixed with something dark and dried that might have been blood. Deep gouges scarred the wooden bed frame. Parallel marks that looked disturbingly like claw scratches, but too large, too deep for any animal I could identify. The scratches continued across the floor, concentrated near the wall, as if something had frantically tried to dig through the logs. "What could do that?" Daniel whispered, kneeling to examine the marks more closely. He pulled off his glove and ran his fingers along the grooves. "These are fresh, within the last few months." "Bear?" I suggested, though I knew it wasn't right. Bears didn't behave this way. They destroyed things with brute force, not with this kind of focused, almost methodical damage. Behind the stove, we found more stains. Dark smears painted the wall in patterns that suggested arterial spray. Not much. Not enough to indicate a killing, but enough to make me taste bile in the back of my throat. Mixed with the dried blood were tufts of gray-brown hair, coarse and thick. "We should document this," I said, pulling out my camera. I photographed everything. The scratches, the stains, the destroyed mattress. Evidence of something, though I didn't want to think too hard about what. Daniel had moved to the table. The surface was covered with carved initials, dates, messages from past rangers and hikers who'd sheltered here over the decades. Most were innocent, names and years, crude hearts with paired initials. But someone had carved something else, scratched deep into the wood with what must have been a knife blade. The letters were rough, desperate. "Don't stay after dark. It comes when you sleep. North window. Don't look." "Daniel," I called softly. He came over, read the message, then looked at the north-facing window, the one covered in grime, facing deeper into the wilderness. "Kids trying to scare each other," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We spent the next hour making the cabin marginally habitable. We cleared the debris from the floor, tested the stove. Miraculously, it still drew air through the crooked chimney, and laid out our sleeping bags on the upper bunks, away from the destroyed lower mattress. Daniel tried the satellite phone repeatedly, moving around the clearing, holding it up at different angles. Nothing. The mountains blocked us completely. "We're truly off the grid," he said, forcing a laugh. "Like the old days." "The old days are overrated," I muttered, arranging my gear. By the time we finished, full darkness had fallen. The temperature inside the cabin hovered just above freezing, even with the stove burning. We ate cold rations, neither of us wanting to deal with cooking. The atmosphere felt oppressive, the silence outside absolute and heavy. I kept glancing at that north window, though I couldn't see anything through the filth. "I'm going to check the perimeter," Daniel announced suddenly, standing up. "Make sure there's nothing we missed. Fresh air, you know." I understood. The cabin felt claustrophobic despite the cold. The walls seemed to press inward. I nodded. "Don't go far, and keep your radio on." He pulled on his parka and stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. I was alone. I sat on the upper bunk, trying to read a book by headlamp, but the words wouldn't stick. My attention kept drifting to those claw marks on the floor, to the desperate message carved in the table, to the north window. The wind had picked up outside, and the cabin creaked and groaned, settling into the cold, normal sounds, I told myself. Old buildings make noise. Then I heard it. From somewhere in the forest, distant but distinct, came a sound that wasn't wind. It started low, almost subsonic, a rumble I felt in my chest before I heard it. Then it rose in pitch, becoming a wail, then a scream, not quite human, not quite animal. It held steady for 5 seconds, maybe 6, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. The door burst open and Daniel stumbled inside, slamming it behind him. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat. "Did you hear that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I managed. "What was it?" He shook his head, moving to the window to peer out, then thinking better of it and backing away. "I don't know. I was maybe 50 yards out, checking the tower foundation, and it just started. From the north, I think. Maybe a mile away, maybe closer. Distance is hard to judge out here." "Mountain lion?" I suggested, though I'd never heard of one in this part of the Adirondacks. Maybe a bobcat. Sound can carry strange and cold air, make things seem different than they are. He was talking fast, trying to convince himself. Or wolves. I know they're not supposed to be this far south, but migration patterns change. Climate change affects ranges. He trailed off. We both knew it hadn't sounded like any animal either of us had studied. We sat in silence, listening. The sound didn't repeat. Gradually, the normal night sounds of the forest resumed, the creak of ice-laden branches, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional crack of a tree settling in the cold. "Long day," Daniel said finally. "We're tired, cold, probably a little dehydrated. Our minds are playing tricks." "Right," I agreed, because there was nothing else to say. We prepared for sleep, checking and rechecking the door latch, positioning our gear within easy reach. Daniel took the bunk near the door. I took the one near the back wall, where I could see the whole room. Neither of us mentioned the carved warning on the table. I lay in my sleeping bag, fully dressed except for my boots, listening to Daniel's breathing slow and deepen as he fell asleep. Exhaustion pulled at me, but I fought it, staring at the dark ceiling, watching shadows cast by the dying stove fire dance across the warped boards. Outside, something moved through the snow. Not the scurrying of small animals or the plodding of deer. Something heavier, more deliberate. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears ached. Nothing, just silence and the sound of my own hammering heart. Eventually, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay alert, exhaustion won. I slipped into an uneasy sleep, filled with dreams of shadows moving between trees, and voices calling my name from the darkness. I woke to cold gray light filtering through the dirty windows, and the immediate visceral certainty that something was wrong. The cabin was silent except for the wind outside, and the creak of settling logs. Too silent. "Daniel?" My voice echoed in the small space, flat and unanswered. I sat up quickly, my sleeping bag rustling. The bunk below mine was empty. Daniel's sleeping bag lay torn open, the fabric ripped in long parallel gashes that exposed the insulation inside. The material was shredded with the same deliberate precision as the old mattress we'd found yesterday. His bag had been destroyed from the inside out. My heart began to race. I swung down from the bunk, my feet hitting the cold floor. Daniel's boots stood exactly where he'd left them beside the stove. His parka hung on the hook by the door. His gloves sat on the table beside the satellite phone. "Daniel," I shouted, louder now, panic creeping into my voice. "This isn't funny." I grabbed my own boots, yanked them on with shaking hands. My mind supplied reasonable explanations even as my gut rejected them. Maybe he'd gone out to relieve himself. Maybe he'd heard something and investigated. But without boots? Without his coat in January? The temperature outside was probably 10 degrees, maybe lower with wind chill. I threw open the cabin door. The sight outside froze me in place. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, perhaps 2 inches, covering everything in pristine white. The clearing around the cabin was utterly undisturbed. No footprints led away from the door. No tracks of any kind marked the snow. Not human, not animal, nothing. The white expanse was perfect and unbroken, as if no one had been outside since the snow stopped falling. But that was impossible. Daniel's sleeping bag was shredded. He was gone. He had to have left somehow. I stepped outside, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I walked carefully around the entire cabin, studying the snow, looking for any sign, any clue. Nothing. The snow lay smooth and undisturbed right up to the cabin walls. Even under the eaves, where someone might have walked without leaving tracks in the clearing, there was nothing. Daniel. I screamed his name until my throat burned, until my voice cracked. The sound echoed off the surrounding peaks and died away. No response came back. The forest absorbed my shouts and returned only silence. I ran to the tower, thinking maybe he'd climbed up despite the dangerous condition. Maybe he'd wanted to try the satellite phone from higher elevation. But the ladder rungs were coated in thick ice, undisturbed. No one had climbed here recently. Panic was giving way to something worse, a creeping dread that made my hands tremble and my thoughts scatter. I forced myself to slow down, to think like the trained wilderness professional I was supposed to be. Systematic search. Document everything. Stay calm. I went back inside and grabbed my radio. This is Ranger Station Volunteer, Bear Mountain Lookout. Requesting immediate assistance. My partner is missing. Repeat. My partner is missing and I need emergency support. Static answered me. I tried again, cycling through every channel. More static. The mountains blocked everything. The satellite phone was equally useless. No signal. The screen showing the same infuriating searching message no matter where I stood. I was utterly alone, miles from help, with a partner who had vanished without a trace. I spent the next hour conducting a proper search pattern, moving outward from the cabin in expanding circles, calling Daniel's name, looking for any sign of him. The forest around Bear Mountain was dense, the underbrush thick even in winter. Visibility extended maybe 30 or 40 yards before the trees and shadows made everything indistinct. I found nothing. Not a broken branch, not a scrap of fabric, not a single footprint. It was as if Daniel had simply ceased to exist. By noon, the temperature had risen slightly, and I was sweating inside my layers despite the cold. My throat was raw from shouting. My mind raced with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Medical emergency, sudden psychotic break causing him to strip and run into the woods. But there would still be tracks. Animal attack. There'd be blood, signs of struggle, something. The only explanation that fit the evidence was impossible. Daniel had vanished from inside a locked cabin without leaving any trace of his exit. I climbed the tower despite my fear of the unstable structure. I needed height, needed to see the surrounding area, needed to find something. The ladder swayed and groaned under my weight, ice cracking off the rungs. I climbed slowly, carefully, my legs shaking from exertion or fear, I couldn't tell. The observation deck at the top was worse than I'd expected. The floor had rusted through in places, leaving gaps that showed the ground 60 feet below. The windows were long gone, just empty frames open to the wind. But the view was expansive. I could see for miles in every direction. Endless forest, rolling peaks, the dark line of a frozen lake to the east. And nothing. No smoke from a fire. No movement. No flash of color that might be Daniel's clothing. Just wilderness stretching away in all directions. As I stood there, wind buffeting the unstable structure, a wave of vertigo and hopelessness washed over me. I was looking at hundreds of square miles of trackless forest. Finding one person without a search team, without aircraft support, was essentially impossible, and the nearest help was 30 miles away through difficult terrain. I climbed back down, each rung an exercise in forced calm. At the bottom, I leaned against the tower's cold metal framework and tried to think clearly. My options were limited: stay and continue searching, hoping Daniel would return, or that rescue would somehow arrive, or leave immediately, hiking out while I still had daylight and strength, and return with help. The logical choice was obvious. I couldn't help Daniel if I froze to death or got lost. I needed to get to civilization, report this, bring back professional search and rescue. But something stopped me. Some instinct, some nameless dread that I couldn't articulate. The idea of walking away from this place, of leaving Daniel, of abandoning him, felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I made my decision. I'd search until dark, then hole up in the cabin for the night with a proper barricade. In the morning, if Daniel hadn't returned, I'd hike out as fast as possible. 12 hours more. I owed him that much. The afternoon passed in a blur of desperate searching. I covered every yard of ground within a quarter mile of the cabin, sometimes crawling through blow-down thickets, sometimes wading through waist-deep drifts. I shouted until I had no voice left. I found nothing. As dusk approached, I forced myself back to the cabin. The temperature was dropping rapidly, the sky taking on that particular clarity that meant bitter cold ahead. I gathered firewood, enough to keep the stove burning through the night. I checked my supplies, food for 3 days, water filtration, first aid kit, everything I'd need to survive the hike out. Inside the cabin, I built a barricade using the table and the remains of the lower bunk frame, wedging it against the door. It wouldn't stop anything determined, but it would make noise, give me warning. I lit the stove and sat on the upper bunk with my back against the wall, able to see the entire room. My hatchet lay beside me, within easy reach. The light faded quickly, the gray dimness giving way to complete darkness broken only by the red glow from the stove's air vents. I did not plan to sleep. Night in the Adirondack wilderness has a quality unlike anywhere else. The darkness is absolute, primal. No light pollution softens it. No distant glow hints at civilization. When the clouds cover the moon as they did that night, the blackness is so complete you can't see your hand in front of your face. I sat in that darkness, listening. The cabin made its normal sounds. The tick of cooling metal, the groan of settling wood, the whisper of wind finding cracks in the walls. But underneath those sounds I heard something else, something moving outside. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crunching through the snow in a slow, measured rhythm. Not the quick patter of a deer or the shuffling gait of a bear. These were steady, purposeful steps. They circled the cabin, stopping occasionally, then continuing. Around and around, never varying pace, never making any other sound. I gripped the hatchet, every muscle tense. My breath came shallow and quick. I stared at the door, at the barricade, willing it to hold. The footsteps paused. Silence stretched out, broken only by my racing heartbeat. Then, with tremendous force, something slammed against the wall behind my head. The impact shook the entire structure. Old wood groaned and cracked. I bit down on my tongue, tasting blood, swallowing a scream. Another blow followed, and another, each one striking the wall with methodical precision, as if testing the structure's integrity, looking for weakness. The assault went on for minutes. The logs held, but barely. I could see them flexing inward with each impact, see chinking dust falling from between the timbers. Whatever was outside possessed incredible strength. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I sat frozen, waiting, my entire body trembling. Minutes passed. Nothing. Had it gone? A new sound made my skin crawl. A slow scraping, like something being dragged across the roof. Back and forth, rhythmic and patient. Metal squealed. The chimney pipe, I realized. Something was pulling at the disconnected chimney pipe. The scraping stopped. A moment later, something dropped down the chimney into the stove. I heard it land in the cold ashes with a wet thump. Silence. Then a soft sound, like fabric tearing. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Whatever had fallen down the chimney remained in the stove, just feet away from me, separated only by cast iron. The stove's door was closed and latched, but the air vents were open, glowing faintly red. A smell began to fill the cabin. The same animal musk I'd noticed when we first arrived, but stronger now, mixed with something else. Decay, rot, the sweet sick stench of spoiled meat. Something white appeared in one of the stove's air vents. A finger. Long, too long. The skin pale and glistening. It probed the vent opening, trying to widen it, scratching at the metal with a nail that scraped and squealed. I couldn't move. Couldn't look away. The finger withdrew, and I heard scraping inside the stove. Then the rattle of the door latch being tested from within. The door was old, the latch simple. It wouldn't hold long. Adrenaline finally broke through my paralysis. I lunged forward, grabbed the heaviest piece of firewood I could find, and jammed it through the latch, bracing it against the floor. The door rattled more violently. The wood held. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The smell faded. I heard movement on the roof again. Then the scraping sound grew distant, then disappeared entirely. I remained motionless, listening so hard my head throbbed. Slowly, the normal night sounds of the forest resumed. Wind, creaking wood, nothing else. Dawn was hours away. I didn't move from my position, didn't take my eyes off the stove. My hands remained locked around the hatchet handle, knuckles white, arms aching. When gray light finally began to seep through the windows, I cautiously approached the stove. Using a long stick, I unlatched the door and pushed it open, ready to run. The stove was empty except for cold ashes and the remains of our last fire. Nothing else. No evidence anything had ever been inside. I opened the cabin door, breaking down my barricade. Outside, the snow lay smooth and undisturbed, pristine and untouched. No tracks, no sign anything had been near the cabin at all. But on the roof, visible from the doorway, something fluttered in the wind. I stepped out, looked up, caught on the twisted metal framework of the tower's lowest level, about 15 feet up, was a torn piece of fabric. Daniel's parka, the red one he'd been wearing yesterday. It hung from a rusted bolt, the fabric shredded, darkened with stains I recognized as blood. Clinging to one torn edge was a clump of gray-brown hair, coarse, thick, like the tufts we'd found behind the stove. I stared up at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Daniel had been wearing that coat yesterday. He'd hung it by the door before bed. How had it gotten up there? How had no one heard him leave, heard him scream? The answer was simple and impossible. Daniel had never left the cabin through the door. He'd been taken out through the chimney, or through the roof itself, dragged up into the tower, and then, what? Taken away. Killed? I couldn't stay here another minute. I had to leave, had to get help, had to survive long enough to tell someone what had happened. I packed with shaking hands, forcing myself to be methodical despite the panic clawing at my chest. Food, water filtration, fire starting kit, first aid, emergency shelter, extra clothes. Every item I might need for 30 miles of winter hiking. The pack was heavy, but I'd rather carry too much than be caught unprepared. The destroyed bunk frames I broke apart, using the straightest boards to fashion a crude sled. I lashed them together with paracord, creating a platform I could drag behind me to carry the bulk of my gear. The snow was deep, waist-deep in places, and breaking trail would be exhausting enough without a 40-pound pack on my back. I took photos of everything with my camera. Daniel's shredded sleeping bag, his abandoned boots and coat, the torn parka caught in the tower, the scratches on the floor and walls. Evidence, proof that something had happened here, that I wasn't losing my mind. Before leaving, I carved a message into the table with my knife, adding to the warning already there. January 2022. Daniel Hoffman. Missing. Tyler Brennan, hiking out for help. Something here, not safe. If someone found the cabin, if other hikers or rangers came to investigate, they'd know what had happened, or at least part of it. I took one last look around the cabin, this place that had transformed from shelter to nightmare. Then I stepped outside, secured the door as best I could, and started south on the trail that had brought us here. The first hours weren't terrible. The morning was clear and cold but not windy, and I had the trail from our approach to follow, our footprints from 2 days ago still visible in the older snow. I made good time, pulling the sled, falling into the rhythm of winter hiking, step, breathe, don't think about anything except forward progress. But as the day wore on, as the trail descended from the ridge and entered deeper forest, I began to realize something was wrong. The landmarks I remembered from our hike-in seemed different, or missing entirely. A distinctive lightning-struck pine we'd passed was nowhere to be found. A stream we'd crossed had moved, or I'd somehow gotten off course. I checked my compass repeatedly. The needle spun lazily, never quite settling. I shook it, thinking maybe the cold had affected it, but it continued to drift, useless. GPS would have helped, but my phone was dead. Had been since we arrived. The satellite phone was no better. Still showing no signal. By mid-afternoon, I had to face facts. I was lost. The trail had vanished. I stood in unmarked forest, surrounded by identical trees, no idea which direction I'd come from or where I needed to go. The sun was hidden behind clouds, making it impossible to orient myself. The forest seemed to press in from all sides, dark and infinite. Don't panic. The first rule of wilderness survival. I forced myself to stop, to think. I had supplies for several days. I knew the general direction south and east toward Cranberry Lake. Even without a trail, I could navigate by terrain. Ridgelines run north-south in this part of the Adirondacks. Follow them down. Find water. Follow the water east. Eventually, I'd hit civilization. I picked a direction that felt right, and started walking. As darkness approached, I began preparing a camp. I chose a spot beneath a massive pine, where the snow was shallower and the overhanging branches would provide some shelter. I built a windbreak using pine boughs and dug a depression in the snow, lining it with more branches to insulate from the ground. Fire was crucial. I gathered deadfall, carefully selecting dry wood from the underside of logs and from branches still attached to trees. With numb fingers, I struck sparks from my fire starter into a nest of birch bark and dry grass I'd found protected beneath a fallen tree. The sparks caught. The bark curled and caught flame, and soon I had a small fire burning. I fed it carefully, building it up until heat began to push back the cold. I melted snow for water, ate a protein bar and some trail mix. Not much, but enough. I needed to ration. I had no idea how long I'd be out here. As full darkness fell, I added more wood to the fire and settled in, my back against the pine's trunk, my sleeping bag pulled around my shoulders. The forest was completely black beyond my small circle of firelight. I kept the hatchet across my lap and tried to convince myself I was safe, that the fire would keep away anything dangerous. I was wrong. Around midnight I'd lost track of exact time, could only estimate the sounds started. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling my camp just beyond the firelight. The same steady rhythm I'd heard at the cabin. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it up like a torch, peering into the darkness. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. "Daniel? Is that you?" The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed down, broken only by the crack and pop of burning wood. Then a voice answered from the darkness. "Tyler." It was Daniel's voice. Exactly his voice. His tone. His inflection. But it came from no single direction. It seemed to surround me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Tyler. Help me. I'm lost." "Daniel." I stood, stumbling forward, the torch held high. "Where are you?" "Here. I'm here. Can't you see me?" I spun in a circle, searching the darkness. I saw nothing. Just trees and shadows and the dancing reflections of my firelight on snow. "I can't find you," my voice broke. "Keep talking. I'll come to you." Silence. Then closer. "Why did you leave me?" The voice held hurt now. Accusation. My heart twisted. Had I abandoned him? Should I have stayed longer, searched more? "I'm going for help," I said, speaking to the darkness. "I'm getting rescue. We'll find you." "Liar." The word was Daniel's voice, but wrong somehow. The pitch too low. The word drawn out too long. "You left me. You left me with it." A shape moved at the edge of my firelight. Tall, thin, nothing like Daniel, but somehow wearing his voice. I stumbled backward, tripping over my sled, landing hard in the snow. The torch fell from my hand, sputtering in the snow. I scrambled back to my fire, grabbed another brand, held it up with shaking hands. The shape was gone. Not real, I whispered to myself. Hallucination, stress, cold, fear, not real. But Daniel's voice came again, from directly behind me now. "I waited for you. Where were you?" I spun. Nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning high, used half my collected wood, and sat with my back against the tree, hatchet in one hand, burning branch in the other, until gray dawn finally lightened the sky. I broke camp at first light, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pack my gear. Every shadow in the forest seemed to move with purpose. Every sound carried threat. I needed to keep moving, needed to get away from this place, from whatever hunted these woods. The day passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. I stumbled through deep snow, pulling my sled, falling repeatedly, getting up, continuing. My legs burned with fatigue. My face was numb from cold. Ice had formed in my beard, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The forest had become alien, nightmarish. Trees seemed wrong, bent at impossible angles. Shadows pooled in places where no shadows should be. More than once, I saw movement from the corner of my eye, figures keeping pace with me through the trees, always just beyond clear vision. Whenever I turned to look directly, they vanished. I was hallucinating. Had to be. Hypothermia affects cognition, and I'd been cold for 3 days straight. Dehydration scrambles perception, and I was probably not drinking enough. Fear does strange things to the mind. But the footsteps following me through the snow weren't hallucinations. They were real, constant, never quite catching up but never falling behind. Heavy steps, crushing through the crust, breaking branches. Something large followed me, paralleling my course through the dense forest. I tried to speed up. My body wouldn't cooperate. I was at my limit, burning through calories faster than I could replace them, hypothermic despite my layers, functioning on adrenaline and desperation. As afternoon faded toward evening, I knew I wouldn't make another night in the open. My fuel was spent. If I stopped to camp again, I'd die, either from exposure or from whatever stalked me through these trees. I had one chance: keep moving through the night, force my body beyond its limits, reach help or die trying. The last of the light drained from the sky. I clicked on my headlamp, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel through absolute darkness. Snow began falling again, thick flakes that swallowed my light and muffled all sound. I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The sled caught on something, a root or rock beneath the snow. I yanked at it, pulled harder, and it came free. But the effort took the last of my strength. I fell to my knees, chest heaving, vision swimming. Get up, I told myself. Get up or die here. I couldn't get up. A voice spoke from the darkness ahead, kind and concerned. You need to rest. I raised my head. A figure stood in my headlamp beam. Daniel. He looked exactly as I remembered. Red parka, wool hat, that concerned expression he got when I pushed too hard in the mountains. Hey, he said gently. You're exhausted. You need to stop before you hurt yourself. Not real, I whispered. You're not real. He crouched down to my level, his face filled with worry. Of course I'm real. I got turned around, but I found the trail. Come on, I know where the cabin is. We can make it back, get warm. For a moment, I wanted desperately to believe him, to accept this impossible mercy, to follow him to safety. But his eyes were wrong. Too dark, too deep, reflecting my headlamp like an animal's. What happened to you? I asked, my voice barely audible. Daniel smiled. His teeth were wrong, too many. Too sharp, wrong shape entirely. I'm right here. I've been here the whole time. Why didn't you answer when I called? I lurched to my feet, stumbling backward. Daniel's form flickered, blurred, became something else. Tall, wrong proportions, limbs that bent incorrectly. It reached for me with hands that had too many fingers. I ran. My pack forgotten, my sled abandoned. I crashed through the forest in blind panic. Branches tore at my face. I fell, got up, fell again. Behind me, heavy footsteps followed. Closer now, no longer maintaining distance. I don't remember much of what happened next. Terror shattered my memories into fragments. Running, falling, the taste of blood in my mouth. Trees that seemed to move, blocking my path. Daniel's voice calling my name from every direction. Cold beyond anything I'd experienced. Settling into my bones like concrete. At some point, I stopped running. My body simply quit. I collapsed in the snow, unable to move, unable to care. My vision had narrowed to a tunnel, the edges going black. This is how it ends, I thought. Not a bad way to go. Just sleep. Just cold. A light appeared ahead. Bright, artificial, beautiful. It grew larger, and with it came a sound, an engine, a snowmobile. Voices shouted. Hands lifted me. I tried to speak but couldn't form words. They wrapped me in blankets, spoke urgently to each other in tones I couldn't quite parse. Severe hypothermia. Need to get him out now. Been out here. Days. The snowmobile's engine roared, and we were moving. I drifted in and out, consciousness flickering. At some point the movement stopped. More voices, brighter lights, warmth that hurt like fire against my frozen skin. Then nothing. I woke in a hospital room, surrounded by machines that beeped softly. Sunlight streamed through a window, so bright it hurt my eyes. An IV ran into my arm. My hands and feet were wrapped in white bandages. A nurse noticed me stirring and came over. Her smile warm but her eyes professional, assessing. Welcome back. How are you feeling? Daniel, I managed, my throat raw. My partner. Did you find him? Her smile faded. Let me get the doctor. Over the next days I learned what had happened. A couple on their anniversary, out for a snowmobile ride, had spotted me by sheer chance. I'd been 3 miles from a seasonal logging road, delirious and in the late stages of hypothermia. They'd gotten me to their truck, then to the hospital in Tupper Lake. Search and rescue teams had gone to Bear Mountain as soon as I was stable enough to tell them where to look. They'd found the cabin exactly as I'd described. Daniel's shredded sleeping bag, his boots and coat, my carved warning on the table. They'd found the torn parka caught in the tower. They had not found Daniel. 3 days of intensive searching. Dogs, aerial reconnaissance, everything. Nothing. No body, no trace, nothing beyond what had been at the cabin. The investigation ruled it an unexplained disappearance. The prevailing theory was that Daniel had experienced some kind of medical emergency, Maybe carbon monoxide poisoning from the stove. Maybe a psychotic break and had fled into the wilderness despite the cold. Hypothermia causes paradoxical undressing, where victims remove their clothes feeling overheated. It wasn't uncommon in wilderness deaths. The theory was logical, evidence-based, sensible. It was also completely wrong. And everyone who'd searched knew it. I could see it in their faces when they interviewed me, hear it in the careful way they asked questions. The older rangers especially. They'd exchange glances when I mentioned the sounds, the footsteps, the voice calling my name. They believed me. They just couldn't say so. Morrison came to visit me before I was discharged. The ranger station chief sat in the visitor's chair, his hat in his hands, looking older than I remembered. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better." It was true. The frostbite had been relatively minor. I'd keep all my fingers and toes. The physical recovery, at least, was going well. "We're closing Bear Mountain Station," Morrison said quietly. "Taking the tower down, boarding up the cabin. It'll be removed from maps." "Good. Tyler," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "What you experienced out there, I want you to know you're not the first. Won't be the last either." I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "The Five Ponds Wilderness is old, son. Really old. There are stories about those woods going back to the Mohawk people, probably earlier. Things that live in the deep places. Things that don't like being disturbed." He turned his hat in his hands. "Most of the time, people who go missing out there, we find them eventually. But sometimes we don't. And the ones we do find, they won't talk about it. Can't talk about it. What they saw breaks something inside." "You believe me," I said. It wasn't a question. I believe these mountains are bigger than we are, and older than we can imagine. I believe there are things we don't understand, maybe can't understand. And I believe you're lucky to be alive. He stood, placed his hat back on his head.
Daniel Hoffman was a good kid. I'm sorry we couldn't bring him home.
After he left, I sat alone in my room, staring out the window at the distant mountains. Somewhere out there, in the endless wilderness, Daniel was gone, taken by something that shouldn't exist, lost to a place that didn't care about our rules or understanding. I thought about the voice calling my name in the darkness, about the heavy footsteps circling my camp, about Daniel's face, smiling at me with wrong teeth, telling me I'd abandoned him. The thing in those woods hadn't been hungry. If it had been, I'd be as gone as Daniel. No, it had been playing with me, testing me, seeing how far it could push before I broke completely. I wondered if it was still out there, waiting by the Bear Mountain cabin, patient and timeless, ready for the next person foolish enough to volunteer. They released me from the hospital after 6 days. I'd regained most of my strength, though I'd lost 15 pounds and still had patches of frostbite healing on my cheeks and ears. The physical damage would mend. The other wounds would take longer. My parents drove up from Albany to take me home. They treated me with exaggerated gentleness, as if I might shatter at any moment. Maybe I would. I spent the 3-hour drive staring out the window, watching the mountains recede behind us, feeling something like relief mixed with guilt. I was leaving. Daniel never would. The investigation formally concluded after 2 weeks. Daniel Hoffman was declared missing, presumed dead from exposure. A memorial service was held at the college. His parents were there, holding each other, faces hollow with grief. I sat in the back, unable to meet their eyes. I couldn't tell them what had really happened. Who would believe it? Even my own memories seemed impossible now, viewed from civilization's safety. In a warm room surrounded by people, the idea of something inhuman stalking the Adirondacks seemed absurd. Psychology offered explanations: trauma, hypothermia-induced hallucination, the mind's attempt to make sense of tragedy by creating narrative. But late at night, when I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel's voice calling from the darkness. I saw that figure standing at the edge of my firelight, wearing his face like a mask, and I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't imagined it. I withdrew from the forestry program, changed my major to environmental policy, something that kept me in offices and classrooms, far from the deep woods. My professors expressed concern but didn't push. Morrison had called them, I learned later, and explained that I'd experienced significant trauma. They gave me space. The nightmares were bad at first. Every night I'd dream of being back at the cabin, watching Daniel's sleeping bag tear itself apart from within. Or I'd dream of running through endless forest while heavy footsteps followed, never catching up but never falling behind. I'd wake gasping, sweat-soaked, convinced something stood in my darkened bedroom. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. She was patient, skilled, never dismissive. She taught me breathing exercises, cognitive behavioral techniques, ways to ground myself when the panic attacks came. She never asked me to explain exactly what had happened in the wilderness. She treated the trauma, not the cause. Gradually, things got better. The nightmares came less frequently. I could walk past wooded areas without my pulse spiking. I even hiked again, though never in the Adirondacks, never in winter, never alone. 3 months after the incident, I received a package. No return address, just my name and dorm room number written in careful block letters. Inside was a folder containing photocopies of old documents, ranger reports, incident logs, newspaper clippings, all dated from before Daniel and I were born. They told a familiar story, repeated across decades. In 1998, 2 hikers reported hearing screams near Bear Mountain. Rangers found their camp abandoned, gear scattered. No bodies were ever found. In 1986, a wilderness guide claimed something had circled his camp for 3 nights straight, calling to him in his wife's voice. He made it out but was hospitalized for psychological evaluation. In 1973, a forestry student went missing near the Five Ponds Wilderness. Her journal was found in an abandoned cabin, the last entry describing someone outside trying to get in. She was never seen again. In 1952, a ranger stationed at Bear Mountain filed a report about unusual activity and requested transfer. 2 weeks later, his relief found the station empty, the door barricaded from inside. The ranger's body turned up that spring 5 miles away, cause of death listed as exposure despite temperatures well above freezing when he disappeared. The reports went back to 1911, when the station was first built. 23 documented incidents over 90 years. Not all fatal, but all sharing common elements: isolation, winter, something that called to people using familiar voices, footsteps with no tracks. A note was paper-clipped to the last page. Handwritten. They won't listen. They never do. But someone should remember. It was signed with Morrison's initials. I called him. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice tired. Figured you'd call eventually. Why send this to me? Because you'll understand it. Because you survived. And because someday someone else is going to go up to that mountain despite our warnings. And they deserve to know what they're walking into. The cabin's supposed to be closed. Off the maps. It is. But maps are just paper, son. The mountain's still there. The thing in those woods is still there. And people are curious creatures. They find things. I thought about that. What is it? The thing that took Daniel? Silence on the line. Then old. That's all I know for sure. The Mohawk had stories about it, about what lived in the deep woods before people came. They stayed away from certain places. We're just not as wise. Someone should kill it. How do you kill something you can't track? Can't see? That might not even be physical. In the way we understand. Smarter people than me have tried to understand it. They failed or stopped trying. All we can do is avoid it, and warn others. After we hung up, I sat holding those photocopied reports, feeling the weight of all those disappeared people. 23 documented cases. How many undocumented? How many more before that? Before anyone kept records. I made my own folder, added my account, Daniel's memorial service program, the news clippings about our disappearance, and my miraculous rescue. I added Morrison's reports. I sealed it all in a waterproof envelope and put it in my closet. Maybe someday I'd show someone. Maybe someday it would matter. 5 years have passed now. I work for the Department of Environmental Conservation. Ironically enough, I help develop wilderness policy, review permit applications, assess environmental impact studies, desk work mostly, safe work. I haven't been back to the Five Ponds Wilderness. I never will. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I pull out that folder and read through the reports again. I think about Daniel, about that last night when I lay in my sleeping bag and heard his sleeping bag tearing itself apart. I wonder if he's still out there in some way, held by whatever hunts those mountains. And I remember the last thing I heard before the rescuers found me. It was Daniel's voice, distant but clear, coming from somewhere in the dark forest. It's lonely here. Come back and keep me company. I'd been half dead from hypothermia, delirious, hypothermic. The voice could have been hallucination, my brain misfiring in its final moments. That's what I tell myself. But I know the truth. Some part of me stayed in those woods. And something in those woods knows my name. The file sits in my closet, adding weight to a promise I made to myself. I'd remember. I'd carry this knowledge, this warning. And if anyone ever asked me about Bear Mountain, about what really happened in the Five Ponds Wilderness in January 2022, I'd tell them the truth. Not the official truth, the tidy explanation of medical emergencies and exposure, but the real truth. There are old places in this world, places older than our understanding, older than our civilization, older than the names we've given them. Some of those places are hungry, some are malevolent, and some, like the deep woods around Bear Mountain, are simply lonely. That's what I told the nurse that night in the hospital. In the hours before hypothermia fully released its grip on my mind, she wrote it in her notes, though it never made the official reports. I saw her write it, watched her hand pause, unsure how to categorize such a statement. It wasn't hungry, I whispered, words slurring. Just lonely. So lonely it'll do anything to keep you. She squeezed my hand, mistaking delirium for grief. But I meant what I said. The thing in those woods doesn't kill out of hunger or malice. It kills out of isolation, out of desperate need for company. And in the endless winter dark, surrounded by silence and snow, it calls to us in the voices of people we love. Sometimes we answer. Sometimes we don't come back. The mountains remain, patient and ancient, waiting for the next person who volunteers to walk into the wilderness alone, waiting for someone new to call to follow, to take into the deep places where the maps end, and something old remembers what the world was like before we named it. I survived. Daniel didn't. That's the truth I carry. That's the weight I'll bear for the rest of my life. And every winter, when the first snow falls and the temperature drops, I find myself listening, half afraid, half expecting to hear a voice I recognize calling my name from the darkness, asking why I left, begging me to come back. I always knew Snowshoe Gulch had a reputation. Most trails around Flathead National Forest do, especially if you talk to the locals who've spent their lives hunting, fishing, and guiding tourists through these mountains. Growing up here in northwest Montana, I'd heard the warnings whispered in gas stations and grocery store aisles, quiet conversations about places where compasses spun uselessly, where experienced hunters refused to venture even in daylight, where the forest itself seemed to reject human presence. My brother Thomas and I would sometimes discuss these stories over beers at the Northwoods Tavern, calling them campfire legends or the paranoid delusions of isolation-addled minds. But neither of us ever laughed too loud about it. We both knew to watch the tree line carefully when dusk settled over the peaks, when shadows stretched long and strange across the snow. When Thomas went missing with his client Isaac Brennan in early February of 2018, those warnings came rushing back with the force of an avalanche. Thomas ran a small guiding business, taking wealthy out-of-state hunters and adventure seekers into the backcountry on snowmobile expeditions. He was 34 years old, experienced beyond his years, and methodical to the point of obsession. He carried 3 GPS units, filed detailed route plans with the Forest Service, and checked in twice daily without fail, morning and evening like clockwork. When his scheduled evening check-in passed on February 8th with only silence crackling through the radio static, we knew something had gone catastrophically, terribly wrong. The temperature that week had plummeted to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Search and rescue coordinator Ben Kowalski told our family that exposure could kill a man in under 3 hours in those conditions, maybe less if the wind picked up. By the time Flathead County Search and Rescue mobilized 72 hours after Thomas's last contact, hope was already a fragile, desperate thing we clung to against our better judgment and the cold mathematics of survival. I didn't join the main search group of 23 volunteers, even though Coordinator Kowalski specifically asked me to. Something in my gut, some instinct I couldn't name, told me that a large group crashing through the forest would find nothing but confusion and their own footprints. Instead, I assembled a smaller team, Sterling Whitehorse, a Blackfeet tracker I'd known since high school who worked for the Forest Service, Deputy Lawrence Hayes from the County Sheriff's Department, and Tyler Morrison, a local snowmobile mechanic who knew every trail, game path, and hidden gully in a 100-mile radius. We left Kalispell before dawn on February 11th, our headlights cutting pale tunnels through the heavy snow flurries that rolled down from the peaks like frozen fog. The temperature gauge on my dashboard flickered between minus 18 and minus 20. Our breath created frost on the inside of our helmet visors within minutes of starting the engines. We rode hard for 3 brutal hours, following the GPS coordinates from Thomas's last ping, which had registered near the western edge of Snowshoe Gulch before his beacon went completely dead. Not just silent, but erased, as if it had never existed. Snowshoe Gulch wasn't marked on most recreational maps. The area was too steep, too narrow, and too prone to avalanches for casual winter travel. It appeared on Forest Service maps as a blank space between contour lines, an absence rather than a presence. Old-timers spoke about it in the way people discuss places they'd rather forget, brief mentions followed by quick deflections and uncomfortable silences that stretched too long. Sterling had told me once, years ago after too many beers, that his grandfather, a medicine man respected throughout the Blackfeet Nation, had called the Gulch the place where Earth remembers how to be hungry. I hadn't understood what that meant then. I was beginning to understand now. We reached the Gulch's narrow entrance around 9 in the morning, though the heavy cloud cover made it feel like perpetual twilight. Sterling slowed his snowmobile ahead of me, raising his fist in the universal signal to stop. He killed his engine, and we all followed suit. In the sudden silence, the forest felt fundamentally wrong in a way I struggled to articulate. There were no bird calls, no chittering of squirrels, no distant crow warnings echoing through the trees, just an oppressive, smothering quiet that seemed to absorb sound rather than simply mark its absence. Sterling pulled off his helmet, his weathered face drawn with concern that bordered on fear. "This place feels sick," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake something that should remain dormant. "My grandfather hunted these mountains for 60 years. He'd take elk and mule deer 15 miles in any direction from here, but never here, not once. He said the forest gave up trying to heal this place generations ago." Lawrence laughed nervously, trying to inject some normalcy into the moment, but the sound came out wrong, too high, too forced. "Come on, Sterling. We can't start spooking ourselves before we even find anything." Sterling didn't look at him. His dark eyes remained fixed on the shadows between the towering pines, studying them with the intensity of a man reading a language the rest of us couldn't understand. "Thomas was smart and careful," he said quietly, finally meeting my gaze. "If he came in here willingly, something pulled him, something he thought he had to investigate." I nodded, my throat tight with unspoken fear. Thomas had been methodical, almost paranoid about safety protocols. He wouldn't deviate from his filed route without a compelling reason, without something extraordinary demanding his attention. We restarted our engines and rode slowly into the gulch, navigating around fallen timber and snowdrifts that reached higher than our handlebars. The deeper we penetrated into that narrow canyon, the more the silence pressed against my eardrums like physical pressure. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it, releasing it in short, shallow gasps that fogged my visor and made my chest ache. Tyler spotted the snowmobiles first, pointing wordlessly with a gloved hand that trembled slightly. Two machines sat in a small clearing about 40 yards ahead, positioned in a strange, deliberate formation, nose to nose in a perfect circle like hands on a clock pointing to 12 and 6. Their headlights were still glowing faintly beneath accumulated snow, weak yellow beams that did nothing to illuminate the growing shadows pressing in around us. Why would they park like that? Tyler's voice carried a tremor he couldn't quite suppress, his breath coming faster now. I dismounted slowly and approached Thomas's sled, brushing away the snow with my glove. His keys dangled from the ignition, swaying slightly in the absent breeze. The fuel gauge registered slightly above half full. The emergency kit in the rear cargo box appeared completely untouched, flares still wrapped, first aid supplies sealed. None of it made any sense whatsoever. Thomas was compulsive about his equipment, checking and rechecking every detail obsessively. He wouldn't abandon his machine with fuel remaining and supplies unused, especially not in temperatures that could kill in hours. Sterling knelt beside the tracks leading away from the snowmobiles, studying them with the focused attention of someone reading a disturbing letter written in a language only he understood. 2 sets of prints, he announced after a long moment, both walking steadily. No running, no signs of panic or struggle. They walked deliberately away from their machines, purposefully. We followed the footprints carefully, weapons drawn now, scanning constantly. The tracks led us through dense undergrowth, weaving between massive pines whose branches blocked what little light filtered through the overcast sky, until they reached a frozen creek about 200 yards from the clearing. The prince approached the creek's bank in a steady stride, then simply ended, vanished, ceased to exist. Lawrence stepped cautiously onto the ice, testing it with his weight before crouching down to shine his flashlight through the crystalline layers. "It's solid," he said, confusion and frustration coloring his voice. "Probably 8, maybe 9 inches thick. No cracks anywhere, no signs of breaking through, no indication anyone fell through the ice." "That's impossible," Tyler muttered, walking along the creek bank in both directions, searching frantically for where the tracks might resume. Footprints don't just disappear into nothing. They have to go somewhere. Sterling stood at the creek's edge, but he wasn't studying the ice or the banks. His eyes traced the branches overhead, following the skeletal canopy that formed a twisted lattice above us. Something removed them, he said, his voice flat and certain in a way that made my stomach clench. This place doesn't work the way other places work. It has its own rules, its own logic, and we don't know what they are. We're operating blind here. The sun began its descent behind the western ridgeline earlier than it should have, bringing with it a darkness that seemed to fall faster and heavier than natural twilight. We made camp on a flat rise overlooking the clearing where we'd found the abandoned snowmobiles, building a fire that crackled weakly against the suffocating stillness. The flames seemed smaller than they should be, struggling against invisible pressure, as if the darkness around us actively consumed the light before it could spread. Sterling walked the perimeter of our camp slowly and deliberately, sprinkling tobacco at measured intervals around our position while speaking softly in Blackfeet. Lawrence watched this ritual with obvious skepticism written across his face, his mouth forming questions he never quite voiced. Tyler paced restlessly near the fire, his eyes constantly darting toward the shadows that lurked and shifted between the trees. After the others rolled out their sleeping bags and settled in for the night, I remained sitting upright, staring into the impenetrable darkness beyond our small ring of firelight. Thomas was out there somewhere in that suffocating black. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, not the casual awareness of wildlife in the woods, but the focused, intelligent attention of something that studied us with purpose and terrible intention. I moved closer to Sterling, who sat motionless near the fire, his face illuminated by the weak, struggling flames. "What did your grandfather say lived out here?" I whispered, not wanting to wake the others. Sterling didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the fire's reach, unblinking. "He called it the consumer of men," he said softly, each word deliberate and weighted. "Something old and patient, something from before the tribes claimed these mountains, before humans walked here at all. He said it stays dormant for years, sometimes decades, sleeping in the deep places. But when someone disturbs it, when someone wakes it up, it remembers what it is, and it gets hungry." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature spread through my chest. Before I could respond, Tyler jerked upright from his sleeping bag with a strangled gasp, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He scrambled backward, pointing frantically toward the trees behind me with a shaking hand. "Someone's out there," he gasped, his voice breaking. "I saw someone tall, really tall, moving between the trees, just standing there, watching us." We grabbed flashlights immediately, weapons ready, scanning the forest beyond our camp with frantic urgency. Our beams swept across snow-covered ground, stark tree trunks and dense shadows, but revealed absolutely nothing. No tracks, no movement, no signs of any presence whatsoever. "You're seeing things," Lawrence said, though his voice carried no conviction whatsoever. His hand trembled visibly as he held his flashlight, the beam wavering. Tyler shook his head violently, retreating closer to the fire until the heat must have been uncomfortable. "I know what I saw. Someone was standing there, just beyond the light, completely still, watching us. I could feel it watching." Sterling rose slowly, his jaw clenched tight. He turned back toward the fire without scanning the darkness any further. "Get what rest you can," he said quietly, settling back into his position. "Tomorrow will test us harder than today did." I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes open, staring up at the black canopy of branches overhead that blocked out even the stars. Rest wouldn't come, couldn't come. Every small sound, the settling of snow on branches, the creak of wood expanding and contracting in the brutal cold, the whisper of wind through the pines, made my heart race and my breath catch. I lay there in the darkness, waiting for dawn, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever existed out here in the gulch was patient and watchful, and that it was waiting for something I couldn't understand. Morning arrived gray and bitter, a low-hanging mist clinging to Snowshoe Gulch like a burial shroud that refused to lift. I'd managed only brief moments of fitful, nightmare-haunted rest, waking repeatedly to the overwhelming sensation of being observed by something that never blinked. Sterling was already awake when I finally gave up on rest, methodically packing gear with the quiet efficiency of someone preparing for something deeply unpleasant. Lawrence stood nearby, checking his weapon repeatedly with obsessive attention, his face drawn with exhaustion and poorly concealed fear. Tyler sat near the dying embers of our fire, staring blankly at the snow, his hands shaking despite his heavy gloves and the relative warmth. We ate quickly, energy bars that tasted like sawdust and cold coffee from thermoses, speaking very little. The plan was straightforward: return to the frozen creek where the tracks vanished, then search the ridge above for any signs of Thomas and Isaac. None of us discussed what we'd do if we found nothing. None of us mentioned the possibility that they might already be beyond any help we could provide. We retraced our route to the creek in silence. The footprints remained exactly as we'd left them, ending abruptly at the ice's edge as if whoever had made them had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. Sterling knelt again, brushing away fresh snowfall with his gloved hand, studying the prints with the intensity of someone trying to read a coded message written in a dying language. This wasn't natural, he said, more to himself than to us, his voice tight. Something interfered here. Something deliberately obscured what happened, erased evidence, removed traces. Lawrence cleared his throat impatiently, eager to move forward, to do something rather than simply stand and speculate. Then let's find out what, and be done with it. We're burning what little daylight we have. Sterling rose slowly, his eyes scanning the steep ridge that loomed above us like a wall. He said nothing, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders remained rigid despite his attempts to appear calm and controlled. With no clear trail to follow, we began climbing the steep incline beyond the creek, picking our way through tangled deadfall and dense clusters of young pines that seemed to deliberately block our path. Snow crunched beneath our boots, the sound echoing oddly through the silent forest in ways that didn't quite make sense acoustically, as if the gulch itself were listening to our progress and considering what to do about it. The higher we climbed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, a physical pressure against my chest that made breathing feel labored and difficult, as if the air itself had grown thicker, heavier, harder to draw into my lungs. Halfway up the slope, Tyler stopped abruptly, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps that fogged the air. What is that?" he whispered, pointing upward with a trembling hand. We turned as one, following his gaze upward through the skeletal branches. About 20 feet above us, wedged firmly into the trunk of a massive pine tree, was the skull of a large deer. Its jaw hung crookedly, broken and displaced at an unnatural angle, the empty eye sockets staring down at us with terrible, hollow accusation. The skull had been picked completely clean, every scrap of flesh and muscle removed with surgical precision, leaving only bone bleached nearly white despite the relatively recent placement. But what made my stomach clench with rising nausea was its position driven into the tree trunk, at least 12 feet above the ground, embedded deeply into the solid wood, as if something had thrown it with tremendous, impossible force. Who could do that? Tyler's voice barely rose above a whisper, his face pale. Lawrence stepped forward, his forensic training warring with his rational mind as he examined the skull carefully. "No blood on the bark," he said, his voice tight and strained. "No drag marks in the snow below. No ladder marks, no climbing equipment marks, no explanation for how this got up here at this height and with this much force." Sterling was staring not at the skull but at the trees around us, his eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of something he desperately hoped not to see. He raised his hand slowly, pointing silently deeper into the forest ahead, his arm rigid. We moved cautiously forward, weapons drawn, our breath misting in the freezing air that seemed to grow colder with each step. What we found ahead made Tyler vomit violently into the snow, choking and gasping as his body rejected what his mind was processing. Scattered through the trees ahead in a rough semicircle, arranged with deliberate, terrible precision, were pieces of animals, deer legs, still attached to portions of hide, wedged between branches at impossible heights, antlers driven into tree trunks at angles that defied physics, a complete rib cage suspended from a high branch by means we couldn't determine, swaying slightly in wind we couldn't feel. Everything appeared completely desiccated, dried to leather, as if something had drained every drop of moisture from the flesh before positioning the remains as territorial markers. Sterling's face had gone pale, all color draining from his weathered features. His usual stoic expression had been replaced by something very close to pure fear. He shook his head slowly, backing away from the grotesque display that surrounded us.
"This is a territorial marker," he said, his voice strained and thin. "A boundary warning. Whatever lives here, whatever claims this space, it wants us gone. It's telling us to leave while we still can."
Lawrence's hands shook as he lowered his rifle, his professional composure cracking visibly. "This is just someone's sick idea of—" "No man did this," Sterling interrupted sharply, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "Look at the height of the placements. Look at the force required to drive solid antler through living wood. Look at the systematic arrangement, the perfect spacing, the deliberate pattern." He gestured to the scattered remains forming their terrible semicircle. "This is intentional communication. Something is claiming this space and warning us that we've already intruded too far into its territory." Silence stretched between us, broken only by Tyler's ragged breathing as he wiped his mouth with the back of his glove. Finally, Sterling spoke again, his voice firm but quiet, carrying absolute conviction. I won't go further. Whatever Thomas disturbed here has woken something ancient and hungry. We've already pushed too deep into its domain. I stared at him, anger and fear battling in my chest, making my heart race. Thomas is still out here, Sterling? I'm not leaving until we find him or we find proof he's gone. Sterling's eyes softened briefly, sympathy flickering across his features. I understand, but I won't risk all our lives. Not for this. Not when the warning is this clear and this aggressive. Lawrence set his jaw defiantly, exhausted and frightened but clinging to his sense of duty. Then stay here, I'll go with him. He nodded toward me. We'll finish what we came to do. Tyler looked between us, his face anguished, shame written clearly across his features. I can't go up there, he whispered, avoiding my gaze. I'm sorry, I can't. Without another word, Lawrence and I continued upward while Sterling and Tyler remained below. The air seemed to grow colder with each step, biting through my layers despite the exertion of climbing. My fingers ached even inside my insulated gloves, a deep penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the ground itself rather than from the surrounding air. We reached the crest of the ridge 15 brutal minutes later. Lawrence stopped suddenly, his entire body going rigid, his face draining of what little color remained. Oh God, he breathed, his voice hollow and distant. Oh God in heaven. Ahead of us, partially buried in a snowdrift against the base of a massive pine, was a dark shape. Bright orange fabric, the unmistakable color of Isaac Brennan's expensive expedition parka, emerged from the white like a terrible flag marking territory claimed. We scrambled forward on hands and knees, frantically digging with our gloved hands, clearing snow away in desperate handfuls. Isaac's face emerged inch by terrible inch, frozen solid, his features locked into an expression of absolute overwhelming terror. His mouth gaped open in a silent scream that would echo forever in my nightmares. His eyes wide and staring at something above him that was no longer there, or perhaps at something we couldn't see, something that existed just beyond our perception. His body was curled in a tight fetal position, knees drawn up to his chest, both feet bare despite the lethal cold, the flesh blackened with severe frostbite. His hands were clenched into rigid claws, as if he'd died grasping at something, fighting against something, trying desperately to ward off something unspeakable that had pursued him through these dark woods. God in heaven, Lawrence whispered again, stepping back, his professional composure completely shattered. What happened to him? What could do this? I stood frozen, unable to tear my gaze from the terror etched permanently into Isaac's features. This wasn't exposure, wasn't simple hypothermia, wasn't any natural cause I could recognize or explain. This was a man who had died in complete, overwhelming fear. Fear so profound and absolute that it had physically transformed his features into a permanent mask of horror. A sharp crack echoed through the forest behind us, the unmistakable sound of a thick branch breaking under significant weight. We both spun around simultaneously, Lawrence raising his rifle with trembling hands, his flashlight beam cutting through the thickening mist. The forest appeared empty, revealed nothing, yet the sensation of presence was absolutely overwhelming. Something massive and patient, breathing slowly and deliberately, just beyond our vision, just outside the reach of our light. We need to move, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Right now. We lifted Isaac's frozen body awkwardly between us, struggling down the treacherous slope toward where Sterling and Tyler waited below. Every step felt heavy, labored, as if the gulch itself physically resisted our attempts to remove what it had rightfully claimed. My breath came in ragged gasps, fogging my vision, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought they might crack. Sterling and Tyler met us halfway down, their faces grim and drawn. Sterling's eyes lingered on Isaac's twisted expression, and I saw something in his gaze, not surprise but terrible confirmation. Recognition of something he'd desperately hoped never to witness with his own eyes. "Leave him here," Sterling said, his voice flat and absolutely certain. Lawrence bristled immediately, exhausted and frightened, but clinging desperately to procedure and protocol. "Absolutely not. We're taking him back. We're not leaving him in this place." Sterling didn't flinch, didn't waver. "Don't bring the marked one back to our fire. It will follow. It knows now that we've touched what belongs to it, what it claimed." "Belongs to it?" Lawrence's voice rose with frustration and poorly controlled fear. "You're talking complete insanity. This is a human being." I raised my hand, stopping the argument before it could escalate. We'll bury him nearby, I said quietly, my throat tight and aching. Away from camp, like Sterling says. We'll mark the location carefully and come back with proper recovery equipment and more people. We dug hurriedly in a small clearing about 50 yards from our campsite, using our snowshoes as makeshift shovels, breaking through the frozen ground with exhausting, painful effort. We placed Isaac's body carefully in the shallow grave, covering him with frozen earth and snow while speaking no words over him. The entire time, Sterling stood apart, facing the darkening woods, his lips moving silently in what I recognized as prayer in his native Blackfeet language. That night, around our rebuilt fire, conversation died completely and permanently. Lawrence sat rigid, gripping his rifle across his lap with white knuckles, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness that pressed in around us. Tyler had curled into his sleeping bag facing the fire, flinching visibly at every small sound that emerged from the forest. Sterling remained motionless at the fire's edge, his face illuminated by the weak flames, watching the tree line with unwavering focus. As exhaustion finally began pulling me toward uncomfortable, fitful rest, I heard it clearly. Slow, deliberate crunching through snow, circling our camp just beyond the reach of the firelight. Each footfall was heavy and patient, moving in a wide arc around our position with methodical precision. The sound would fade briefly to the north, then return from the east, always maintaining its distance, never quite close enough to see but near enough to know absolutely that it was there, that it was real, that it was watching and waiting. I lifted my head, scanning the darkness with wide eyes, but the forest revealed nothing but shadows and the pale gleam of snow. The footsteps continued their patient circuit, methodical and relentless, circling endlessly through the night like a predator marking its territory. When I finally closed my eyes, one thought dominated all others. We had never been alone out here. Something had been watching since the moment we entered the gulch, and now it was growing bolder, more confident, more willing to reveal its presence. Dawn broke cold and gray, frost forming intricate, beautiful patterns on every exposed surface that seemed to mock our situation. I woke to find Sterling already packed, his gear arranged methodically, his face set with grim determination and barely controlled fear. Tyler sat hunched near the dead fire, rocking slowly back and forth, his eyes red and exhausted. Lawrence loaded his rifle with shaking hands, checking and rechecking the chamber with obsessive repetition that accomplished nothing. Sterling met my eyes as I sat up stiffly, his expression apologetic but absolutely firm. "We need to leave now. There's nothing here we can save. Whatever your brother was has been consumed by this place, transformed by it. Thomas is still out there," I said, my voice rough from the cold and lack of proper sleep. "I won't abandon him. I can't." Sterling sighed heavily, setting down his pack. "Your brother isn't here anymore. Not in any way you'd recognize. This place doesn't return what it claims. It changes them, uses them, makes them part of itself." Lawrence interrupted sharply, stepping forward with renewed determination. "Enough with the superstition. We found Isaac's body, which proves people can be recovered here. Thomas might still be alive, still be himself." Sterling's eyes darkened with something between pity and frustration. "What's alive in this gulch isn't Thomas anymore. Trust me on this." I hesitated, uncertainty tightening my chest painfully. Then Lawrence touched my shoulder, his voice carrying desperate reassurance. "We came to find him. Let's finish what we started. We owe him that much." I nodded slowly, trying to ignore Sterling's warning, and adjusted my pack with numb fingers. Tyler immediately shook his head, backing towards Sterling with panic clear in his eyes. "I can't go back up there," he whispered, shame evident in every word. "I just can't." Sterling placed a reassuring hand on Tyler's shoulder, then turned to Lawrence and me. His voice carried clearly in the oppressive silence. "If you see it, don't run. Running triggers pursuit, activates hunting instinct. Don't look directly at it if it shows itself. Don't meet its eyes if it has any." The climb back to the ridge was absolutely grueling. Neither Lawrence nor I spoke at all, our breathing heavy in the thin, brutal air. He led with his rifle ready, scanning constantly, his professional training warring with obvious, barely controlled fear. My thoughts spiraled downward, dread gnawing at my resolve with each painful step. As we crested the ridge where we'd found Isaac, we both froze simultaneously. The forest had changed dramatically overnight. Branches had been broken deliberately, arranged in a crude circle around the entire area. Limbs twisted at physically impossible angles to form grotesque skeletal sculptures that seemed to watch us. The snow within the circle had been disturbed extensively, compressed and churned, as if something very large had been dragged through repeatedly in circles. And there, clearly visible in the fresh snowfall, were boot prints. Thomas's distinctive Sorel boots. The tread pattern I'd recognize absolutely anywhere. The tracks led deeper into the woods, disappearing behind a dense wall of tangled pines that seemed to form a deliberate barrier. My pulse quickened painfully, hope and dread tangling together in my chest. "These are fresh," Lawrence whispered, his voice tight. "Within the last few hours, he's close." We followed slowly and carefully, weapons ready, scanning every shadow, every movement. The prints wound deeper into increasingly dense forest, the trees pressing closer together, the canopy overhead blocking what little light filtered through the heavy clouds. Then, from just beyond a thick cluster of pines, came Thomas's voice. Thin, hollow, but unmistakably his. "Hello? Is someone there? Please, someone help me." I broke forward without thinking rationally. Desperation completely overwhelming caution. Lawrence shouted sharply behind me. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I pushed through the dense branches, emerging into a small clearing. Thomas stood at the far end, perhaps 30 feet away, barefoot in the deep snow that should have killed him hours ago. His parka hung torn and completely open, revealing only a thin thermal shirt beneath. His skin appeared blue-white, his lips cracked and bleeding from severe exposure. He trembled violently, continuously, staring not at me but through me, his eyes glazed and completely unfocused. "Thomas," I gasped, my breath hitching painfully. "We're here. We found you. We're getting you out of this place." He didn't move at all, didn't acknowledge my words in any way. Instead, his eyes widened suddenly, focused on something behind me, and his face transformed into an expression of absolute, pure terror. A sound erupted from the forest behind us. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something between them that shouldn't exist. A guttural, resonant bellow that seemed to vibrate through my chest cavity, shaking my bones, rattling my teeth. It was the sound of something massive, something that didn't belong in any taxonomy I understood or could comprehend. Lawrence spun around, rifle raised, firing blindly into the trees with desperate panic. The shots echoed uselessly, seeming to be swallowed by the forest before they could travel. I grabbed Thomas's arm. His skin felt like solid ice through my glove, wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, and pulled him toward me with all my strength. He moved mechanically, offering no resistance but no help either, like a sleepwalker being guided through a nightmare. "Run," Lawrence screamed, ejecting his spent magazine and fumbling desperately for another with shaking hands. I dragged Thomas forward, stumbling through the snow, my heart hammering so violently, I thought it might actually burst through my ribs. Behind me, I heard Lawrence scream, a raw, agonized sound that cut off abruptly and completely, replaced by a horrible, wet tearing noise and then absolute silence. I didn't turn back. Couldn't turn back. Wouldn't turn back. We crashed through the trees, sliding and falling repeatedly down the slope toward where Sterling and Tyler waited with the snowmobiles. Branches tore at my clothes, ripped my skin, drew blood. Snow filled my boots, soaked my clothes. My lungs burned in the freezing air. Sterling rushed to meet us, his eyes wide with urgent terror. "Keep moving," he shouted, gripping Thomas's other arm firmly, pulling us both toward the waiting machines. Behind us, the forest exploded with the sound of massive branches, snapping like gunshots. Something huge pursuing through the dense undergrowth with deliberate purpose. Not running, walking, moving with patient, methodical purpose, knowing we couldn't truly escape. Tyler had already started the snowmobiles, their engines roaring to life, shattering the oppressive silence completely. Sterling shoved Thomas roughly onto the sled behind Tyler, then turned sharply toward the trees, chanting urgently in Blackfeet, his voice rising above the engine noise. He pulled his knife, cutting his palm deeply and letting blood drip onto the snow while continuing his desperate prayer. "Go," he commanded, pushing me toward the remaining sled. "Now, don't look back." I hesitated only one terrible second before climbing on, looking back just long enough to see Sterling facing the dark trees, knife raised, blood running freely down his hand, his voice strong and defiant as he chanted prayers in a language older than English, older than this country. Then we were moving, racing away from Snowshoe Gulch, the forest blurring around us into meaningless shapes. We rode hard and recklessly, not slowing for obstacles, taking risks we'd normally never attempt. Tyler led, Thomas clinging mechanically to his back without awareness. I followed, my hands completely numb on the controls, my mind refusing to process what had happened, what we'd left behind. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail, miles from the gulch in open terrain where the sky was finally visible overhead. Only then did Tyler kill his engine. I slid off my sled, legs shaking so badly I nearly collapsed into the snow. I turned slowly to Thomas. He sat motionless on the sled, eyes distant and unfocused, his lips moving silently in constant repetition. I moved closer, trying to hear what he was saying, what he was repeating over and over. "It watches through the bones," he whispered mechanically. "It watches through the bones. Never closes its eyes. Never stops watching. Never sleeps. It watches through the bones." 2 days later, Thomas was found by a county road crew, wandering barefoot and incoherent down Highway 83, 15 miles from Snowshoe Gulch. He remembered nothing coherent or useful, offering only fractured whispers about the Tall One and the consumer of men. Lawrence's body was never recovered despite extensive searches. Sterling never came out of the gulch, though they searched for 3 weeks. 6 terrible weeks passed before I could bring myself to visit Thomas at the psychiatric facility in Missoula. He'd been diagnosed with severe trauma-induced dissociation, permanent hypothermia damage to his extremities requiring partial amputation of 3 toes, and what the doctors clinically called acute delusional disorder with paranoid features. He refused to go near windows after dark, kept his eyes fixed constantly and obsessively on shadows, and spoke rarely to anyone. As I prepared to leave after a brief, painful visit where he barely acknowledged my presence, he finally looked directly at me, his eyes focused with terrible, absolute clarity for the first time. "You can't see it unless it decides to show itself," he said, his voice strained and hollow but perfectly clear. "But you always feel it watching. Always. It waits in the cold places, the old places, the forgotten places where Earth remembers hunger. It's patient beyond human understanding. It can wait forever, eternally. And it's still there, right now, waiting for someone else to come. Waiting and watching and hungry." I left him there in that sterile white room, haunted by his words, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever we had awakened in Snowshoe Gulch remained, patient and hungry, and watching silently from the shadows between the trees, waiting with infinite patience for the next person foolish enough to enter its ancient, terrible domain. This happened in 1986. I was 26 years old then, still trying to figure out my place in the world. My name is Maya Lopez, and what I'm about to tell you has haunted me for nearly 4 decades. It's a story of terror, of ancient forces beyond our understanding, and of the thin veil between our world and something much darker. Late October in California can be deceiving. The days are often warm, kissed by lingering summer heat, but the nights carry a chill that seeps into your bones. It was during one of these October nights that my life changed forever. I remember the day we left for Yosemite National Park with painful clarity. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. I stood in front of my apartment building, a duffel bag at my feet, waiting for Liam to arrive in his beat-up RV. Liam was my boyfriend of 3 years. He was the outdoorsy type, all tan skin, sun-bleached hair, and an ever-present smell of campfire smoke. I loved him, or at least I thought I did, but lately things had been off. We'd been arguing more, about little things at first, but gradually about bigger issues. This trip was his idea, a chance to reconnect and get back to basics. I wasn't sure if basics was what our relationship needed, but I'd agreed to go anyway. The RV rumbled around the corner, its faded blue paint peeling in places. Liam grinned at me from the driver's seat, his enthusiasm palpable even from a distance. I forced a smile in return, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. "Hey, babe," Liam called out as he brought the vehicle to a stop. "Ready for an adventure?" I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. As I approached the RV, the side door slid open, revealing our travel companions. "Maya, get in here, it's freezing." That was Zoe, Liam's younger sister. At 22, she was a bundle of energy and optimism, always ready for the next big thing. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her green eyes sparkled with excitement. Behind her sat Kai, Liam's best friend and self-proclaimed folklore enthusiast. Kai was 29, with a scruffy beard and glasses that gave him a scholarly air. He waved at me, already nose-deep in some dusty old book. I climbed into the RV, the familiar smell of old upholstery and Liam's preferred air freshener, pine of course, washing over me. As I settled into the passenger seat, Liam leaned over and kissed my cheek. "This is going to be great," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I know things have been rough lately, but this trip, I really think it'll help us, Maya." I wanted to believe him. Part of me did. But another part, a part that had been growing louder lately, wondered if this was just another example of Liam pushing me into something I wasn't comfortable with. As we pulled away from my apartment, leaving behind the safety of the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were driving towards something dark and unknown. If only I had listened to that instinct. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. Zoe chatted animatedly about her college classes, while Kai occasionally chimed in with random historical facts about the areas we passed through. I stayed quiet, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to rolling hills, and eventually to the beginnings of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. It was as we entered the foothills that Kai's topic of conversation shifted to something that would prove eerily prophetic. "Did you guys know that Yosemite has a rich history of Native American legends?" he asked, leaning forward between the front seats, especially around Mariposa Grove. Liam perked up at this. He always loved a good story, especially if it added an air of mystery to our outdoor excursions. "Oh yeah? Like what?" Kai's eyes gleamed with enthusiasm. "Well, there's one legend in particular that's always fascinated me. It's about a guardian spirit of Mariposa Grove." I felt a chill run down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. "What kind of guardian spirit?" "According to the stories passed down by some of the local tribes, there was once a benevolent spirit that protected the ancient sequoias of Mariposa Grove," Kai explained. "It was said to be a force of nature itself, ensuring the health of the forest and the safety of those who respected the land." Zoe leaned in, clearly intrigued. "So what happened? You said was once benevolent." Kai's expression grew somber. "The legend says that as white settlers moved into the area, they began to exploit the land. Trees were cut down, sacred sites were desecrated. The spirit's nature changed in response to this violation. It became angry, vengeful." A heavy silence fell over the RV. Even Liam, usually quick with a joke to lighten the mood, seemed affected by the story. "Now," Kai continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "they say the spirit still guards the grove, but with a twisted purpose. It's said to curse those who disrespect the forest, luring them deep into the woods where they're never seen again." I shivered involuntarily. "That's just a story though, right? I mean, there's no actual evidence of anything like that?" Kai shrugged. "Who knows? But I can tell you this. A lot of locals won't go into Mariposa Grove after dark. And there are reports here and there of hikers going missing. Nothing concrete, but enough to make you wonder." Liam laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, man. You're gonna freak Maya out before we even get there. It's just an old legend." But as I looked out the window at the darkening sky, the trees growing denser as we approached Yosemite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were driving into something far more dangerous than a simple camping trip. Little did I know then just how right that feeling would prove to be. We arrived at the Yosemite National Park entrance just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The park ranger who greeted us looked tired, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. "You folks heading to a campground?" he asked, glancing at our RV. Liam nodded. "Yeah, we're planning to park at the Mariposa Grove campsite and do some hiking in the area." The ranger's expression flickered for a moment. Was it concern? He handed Liam a map and some paperwork. "Make sure you stick to the marked trails, especially around Mariposa Grove. It's easy to get turned around in there, even for experienced hikers." As we drove away, I couldn't help but notice the ranger watching us in the rearview mirror, his figure growing smaller but no less ominous. The drive to Mariposa Grove was tense with anticipation. As we wound our way through the park, the massive sequoias began to appear, their enormous trunks stretching impossibly high into the darkening sky. Even from the confines of the RV, their presence was overwhelming. We reached the campground just as true darkness fell. Liam maneuvered the RV into a spot, and we all piled out, stretching our legs after the long drive. "Oh wow," Zoe breathed, staring up at the trees surrounding us. "They're even bigger than I imagined." Kai was already pulling out his camera, snapping photos in the fading light. "Some of these trees are over 2,000 years old," he said. "Just think about all they've seen." I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The temperature had dropped significantly, and there was a stillness in the air that felt unnatural. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just silence. Liam came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You okay, babe? You've been quiet." I leaned back into him, seeking comfort in his familiar warmth. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired from the drive, I guess. He kissed the top of my head. Let's get some food in you. I'll start a fire. As Liam busied himself with the campfire and Zoe helped unpack our supplies, I found myself drawn to the edge of our campsite. The trees seemed to loom larger here, their massive trunks disappearing into the darkness above. I squinted, trying to make out their tops, when a movement caught my eye. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move between the trees. A flash of pale skin, or perhaps antlers. But when I blinked, it was gone. Maya. Kai's voice made me jump. He was standing a few feet away, a concerned look on his face. Everything all right? I shook my head, trying to clear it. Yeah, sorry. I just thought I saw. Never mind. It was probably nothing. Kai glanced towards the trees, then back at me. You know, the Native Americans believed that the sequoias were sacred. They said that spirits lived within them, watching over the forest. Kai, I said, a note of warning in my voice. Please don't start with the ghost stories. Not tonight. He held up his hands in surrender. Sorry. Force of habit. Come on, I think the fire's ready. We gathered around the campfire, its warm glow a comforting barrier against the encroaching darkness. Liam had prepared a simple meal of hot dogs and canned beans, which tasted better than any gourmet dinner after our long day of travel. As we ate, Zoe regaled us with her plans for the hike tomorrow. I've read about this tree called the Grizzly Giant, she said, her eyes shining with excitement. It's one of the oldest and largest trees in the grove. We have to see it. Liam nodded, his mouth full of hot dog. Definitely. I was thinking we could do the full loop trail. It's about 7 miles, takes us past all the major attractions. I felt a twinge of anxiety at the thought of such a long hike, but I pushed it down. This trip was important to Liam, and I was determined to make an effort. As the night wore on, our conversation drifted to lighter topics. Funny stories from Zoe's college adventures, Kai's latest research project, plans for the upcoming holidays. But every so often, I would catch one of us glancing nervously at the darkness beyond our campfire's light. It was well past midnight when we finally decided to turn in. Liam and I took the RV's small bedroom, while Zoe and Kai set up sleeping bags in the main area. As I lay in bed, listening to Liam's steady breathing beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of branches in the wind. Just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, a sound cut through the night. A long, low whistle, almost musical in nature. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. Liam, I whispered, shaking his shoulder. Liam, did you hear that? He mumbled something incoherent, still mostly asleep. The whistle came again, closer this time. It didn't sound like any bird or animal I'd ever heard. There was something almost human about it, but distorted, wrong somehow. I lay there rigid with fear, straining my ears. But the sound didn't come again, and eventually, exhaustion overcame my terror, pulling me into a fitful sleep. I dreamed of trees that moved, of antlered figures dancing in moonlight, and of a voice that whispered my name from the darkness. When I woke the next morning, the dream clung to me like cobwebs, leaving me with a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. Little did I know, it was only the beginning of our nightmare in Mariposa Grove. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. As I stepped out of the RV, the air held that particular autumn chill that seems to awaken every sense. The sequoias towered around us, their massive trunks glowing a warm reddish-brown in the early morning light. Liam was already up, tending to a small campfire and brewing coffee in a battered percolator. He looked up as I approached, flashing me that boyish grin that had first drawn me to him. Morning, sleepyhead, he said, handing me a steaming mug. Sleep okay? I hesitated, the memory of that strange whistle still fresh in my mind, but in the light of day, it seemed foolish, almost embarrassing. Yeah, fine, I lied, taking a sip of coffee. It was strong and bitter, just the way I liked it. Zoe emerged from the RV next, her hair a tangled mess and eyes still heavy with sleep. Coffee, she mumbled, making grabby hands at the pot. Kai was the last to join us, looking surprisingly alert. He had his nose buried in a trail guide, occasionally muttering to himself and making notes. As we ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and dried fruit, Liam laid out the plan for the day. So I figured we'd start with the Grizzly Giant Loop Trail, he said, pointing to a spot on the map spread out before us. It's about a 2-mile hike, should take us past some of the most famous trees in the grove. Zoe clapped her hands excitedly. including the grizzly giant itself, right? Liam nodded. Yep, and the California tunnel tree too. I tried to muster some enthusiasm, but my stomach was churning with anxiety. Something about this place felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched. We packed our day packs with water, snacks, and first aid supplies. Kai insisted on bringing his bulky camera equipment, despite Liam's protests about the extra weight. As we set off down the trail, I found myself hanging back slightly, my eyes darting from tree to tree. The sequoias were undeniably beautiful, their massive trunks stretching so high that I had to crane my neck to see where they disappeared into the canopy. But there was something almost oppressive about their size, as if they were pressing in around us. Kai fell into step beside me, his voice low. You feel it too, don't you? I glanced at him sharply. Feel what? He gestured vaguely at our surroundings.
This place.
There's something, I don't know, powerful about it. Ancient. I nodded slowly, relieved that I wasn't the only one sensing it. It's like the air is thick with something. History, maybe? Or magic? Kai supplied, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Before I could respond, Zoe's voice rang out from up ahead. Oh my God, guys, look at this. We hurried to catch up with Liam and Zoe, who had stopped in a small clearing. There, rising before us like a monument to nature itself, was the grizzly giant. The sequoia was enormous, its trunk wider than a house and disappearing into the sky above us. The bark was deeply furrowed, bearing the scars of countless fires and storms it had weathered over its long life. It's estimated to be around 2,700 years old, Kai said, his voice hushed with awe. Can you imagine? It was already ancient when Rome was founded. We stood there in silence for a long moment, each lost in our own thoughts. I found myself wondering what this tree had seen over the centuries, what secrets it held within its rings. As we continued our hike, the trail winding between these colossal trees, I began to relax slightly. The beauty of the grove was undeniable, and the exertion of the hike was helping to quiet the nagging sense of unease in the back of my mind. But then we reached the California tunnel tree, and everything changed. The tree was massive, like all the sequoias, but what made it unique was the tunnel carved through its base, large enough for a person to walk through. Zoe immediately ran towards it, eager to get a picture. Wait, Kai called out, his voice sharp with concern. Look at this. We gathered around where he was pointing. There, carved into the bark just beside the tunnel, was a symbol. It looked almost like an eye, but distorted, with jagged lines radiating out from it. What is that? Liam asked, reaching out to touch it. Kai grabbed his wrist, stopping him. Don't. It's a warding symbol. I felt a chill run down my spine. Warding against what? Kai's eyes met mine, and I saw real fear there for the first time. Evil spirits, the kind that aren't supposed to exist. As if in response to his words, a gust of wind swept through the grove, carrying with it the faintest hint of that eerie whistle I'd heard the night before. The leaves rustled ominously, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw shadows moving between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. Liam laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. Come on, guys. It's probably just some old graffiti, nothing to worry about. But as we continued our hike, the symbol burned in my mind, a warning we had chosen to ignore. And with each step deeper into the grove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led somewhere, drawn in by some force we couldn't understand or resist. The true horrors of Mariposa Grove were about to reveal themselves, and we were woefully unprepared for what was to come. As we continued our hike deeper into Mariposa Grove, the atmosphere seemed to shift subtly. The sunlight filtering through the canopy took on a strange greenish tinge, and the air grew noticeably cooler. The trail, which had been well maintained near the more popular attractions, began to narrow and twist unpredictably. Are you sure we're still on the right path? I asked Liam, who was leading our group with the trail map. He frowned, studying the paper intently. I think so. The map shows the trail should widen again just ahead. But as we pressed on, the path only seemed to grow more overgrown. Roots protruded from the earth, threatening to trip us at every step. The massive sequoias pressed in closer, their trunks blocking out more and more of the sky. Zoe's earlier enthusiasm had dampened considerably. Guys, maybe we should turn back, she suggested, her voice tinged with worry. This doesn't feel right. Kai nodded in agreement. The ranger did warn us to stick to marked trails. I don't see any markers anymore. Liam's jaw set stubbornly. We can't be that far off. Let's just go a little further. If we don't see anything familiar in the next 10 minutes, we'll turn around. I wanted to protest, to insist we head back immediately, but something held me back. It was as if a fog had settled over my mind, dulling my instincts. So instead, I nodded silently, and we pressed on. As we walked, I noticed more symbols carved into the trees. Eyes, spirals, and other shapes I couldn't decipher. They seemed to be growing more frequent and more complex. Suddenly, Kai stopped short, causing me to bump into him. "Look," he whispered, pointing ahead. In a small clearing stood a deer, but something was terribly wrong. Its body was unnaturally still, yet its head twitched and jerked in a way that made my stomach churn. As we watched in horror, it slowly turned to face us. Its eyes were milky white, devoid of life, yet somehow still fixed upon us with terrifying intensity. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." No one argued this time. We turned and began to retrace our steps, moving as quickly and quietly as we could, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all blended together, and the path seemed to shift and change with every step. As the light began to fade, panic set in. We were lost in Mariposa Grove, with night approaching fast. "We need to set up camp," Liam finally admitted, his voice heavy with defeat. "It's too dangerous to keep wandering in the dark." We found a small clearing and hurriedly set up our tents. No one spoke much as we prepared a meager dinner from our packed supplies. The silence of the grove was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig that made us all jump. As we huddled around our small campfire, Kai cleared his throat. "I think," Liam scoffed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, man. Not the time for ghost stories." "It's not a story," Kai insisted. "The symbols, the deer, the way we got lost, it all fits with the legends. The spirit of the grove is real, and I think we've angered it somehow." Before anyone could respond, a sound cut through the night, that same eerie whistle I'd heard before, but louder now and seemingly coming from all directions at once. Zoe whimpered, pressing closer to her brother. "What is that?" "Don't listen to it," Kai warned. "In the stories, the spirit uses sounds to lure people away." But even as he spoke, I felt a strange pull. The whistle was forming patterns, almost like words just on the edge of comprehension. I found myself standing, taking a step towards the darkness beyond our fire's light. "Maya!" Liam's voice snapped me back to reality. He was gripping my arm, his face pale with fear. "What are you doing?" I blinked, disoriented.
I don't know. I thought I heard."
A twig snapped loudly in the darkness, and we all spun towards the sound. There, just at the edge of the firelight, stood a figure. It was tall, inhumanly so, with a body that seemed to shift and waver like smoke. Atop its head were massive antlers, branching out like the limbs of the sequoias themselves. But it was the eyes that froze the breath in my lungs, glowing amber orbs that held ancient alien intelligence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised a long, spindly arm and pointed directly at me. A voice that was not a voice filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. "You do not belong here." The fire suddenly went out, plunging us into total darkness. Chaos erupted as everyone scrambled for flashlights, calling out to each other in panic. When light finally cut through the darkness again, the figure was gone. But carved into the trunk of the nearest sequoia, still smoking as if burned by some intense heat, was a new symbol, an eye, weeping what looked horribly like blood. As the reality of our situation sank in, I realized with growing dread that our nightmare in Mariposa Grove was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The darkness pressed in around us, seeming to swallow the feeble beams of our flashlights. We huddled together, backs to the rekindled fire, straining our eyes and ears for any sign of the entity's return. The carved eye on the sequoia trunk seemed to watch us mockingly, a constant reminder of the supernatural danger we faced. "What do we do now?" Zoe's voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. Kai spoke up, his usual enthusiasm replaced by grim determination. "We need to protect ourselves. In the legends, there are ways to ward off evil spirits." Liam scoffed, but there was no real conviction behind it. "You can't seriously believe." "Look around you, Liam," I snapped, fear making my voice sharper than intended. "After what we just saw, how can you not believe?" He fell silent, the reality of our situation finally sinking in. Kai continued, "We need to create a circle of protection. Salt would be best. But we don't have any. We'll have to use what we have. We sprang into action, desperation driving us. Using sticks, we etched a large circle in the dirt around our campsite. Kai instructed us to place small stones at regular intervals along the line, murmuring what he claimed were protective chants as we worked. As we finished the circle, a cold wind whipped through the clearing, causing the fire to flicker wildly. The whistle returned, louder than ever, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Don't listen to it," Kai shouted over the noise. "Stay in the circle, no matter what." The wind intensified, becoming a howling gale that threatened to tear our tents from the ground. Debris swirled around us, leaves, twigs, and something that looked horribly like bones. Through it all, that unearthly whistle continued, worming its way into our minds. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The whistle formed words in my head, incomprehensible yet somehow enticing. I found myself taking a step towards the edge of the circle, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. "Maya, no." Liam's arms wrapped around me, pulling me back. The contact broke whatever spell had taken hold, and I collapsed against him, shaking. The assault continued through the night. We took turns keeping watch, fighting exhaustion and the constant temptation to step outside the circle. The entity appeared several more times, always just at the edge of our vision. A flash of antlers here, a glimpse of glowing eyes there. As dawn finally began to break, the attack subsided. We looked at each other, haggard and shell-shocked. No one had slept, and the night's events had left us all changed. "We need to get out of here," Liam said, his voice hoarse. "Now, while it's light." We quickly packed up our campsite, staying within the protective circle as much as possible. As we prepared to leave, Kai held us back. "Wait," he said, pulling out his journal. "We need to make an offering." "An offering?" Zoe asked, incredulous. "To that thing?" Kai nodded grimly. "It's our best chance of appeasing the spirit and getting out of here safely. The legends say it demands a personal sacrifice." We each contributed something. A cherished photo, a lucky charm, even a lock of hair. Kai placed them in a small pile just outside our circle, then lit them on fire, murmuring words in a language I didn't recognize. As the smoke rose, the forest around us seemed to exhale. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and for the first time since we'd entered the grove, I felt a glimmer of hope. We set off, Liam in the lead with the map, trying to retrace our steps. But it quickly became apparent that the grove had other plans for us. Paths that should have been there were overgrown, or simply gone. Landmarks we remembered seeing were nowhere to be found. As the day wore on, our water supplies dwindled, and hunger began to gnaw at us. The sequoias loomed ever larger, their shadows seeming to reach out like grasping hands. "We're going in circles," Zoe finally said, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. She was right. We had passed the same twisted tree at least 3 times now. The grove was toying with us, leading us deeper into its heart. As the light began to fade once more, dread settled over us like a physical weight. We couldn't survive another night like the last. Something had to change, or we would never leave this place alive. That's when we heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this ancient forest. The distant but unmistakable rumble of a vehicle. Hope surged through me. "The road," I cried. "We must be close to the road." We took off towards the sound, stumbling in our haste. But with each step, the noise seemed to shift, coming from a different direction. It was leading us on, I realized with growing horror. Just like the whistle, we burst into a clearing and froze. There, in the center, stood our RV. But it was wrong, twisted and warped as if it had been there for decades, roots and vines growing through its rusted frame. And there, etched into its side in letters that still glowed with unearthly heat, was a message. "Only one may leave." The truth hit us like a physical blow. The spirit of Mariposa Grove wasn't just trying to scare us away. It was never going to let us all escape. It wanted a sacrifice, a real one this time. As night fell once more, we huddled in the twisted remnants of our RV, the enormity of our situation crushing down upon us. We had to make an impossible choice, and time was running out. The long night ahead promised to be one of difficult decisions, fraying sanity, and the ultimate test of our humanity. And through it all, the ancient sequoias would watch, silent sentinels to our struggle for survival. The interior of the twisted RV was a mockery of the comfortable space we'd left behind. Rust ate away at the walls, and the acrid smell of decay filled our nostrils. We huddled together on what remained of the fold-out couch, the gravity of our situation weighing heavily upon us. "This can't be real," Zoe whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We can't actually be expected to choose who lives and who dies," Kai finished grimly. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his scholarly demeanor crumbling under the strain. "But that's exactly what the spirit wants." Liam paced the small space, his movements jerky and agitated. "No, no way. We are not playing by its rules. There has to be another way out of this." I wanted to believe him, but hope felt like a distant memory. The grove had stripped away our illusions, leaving only harsh reality. "What if there isn't?" I asked softly. "What if this is our only choice?" The silence that followed was deafening. We couldn't look at each other, each lost in our own thoughts. Who among us was worthy of survival? Who would we condemn to death? As if sensing our turmoil, the forest outside came alive with sound. That haunting whistle returned, accompanied by the creaking of massive trunks and the rustling of countless leaves. It was as if the entire grove was laughing at our predicament. Suddenly, Liam slammed his fist against the rusted wall. "This is insane. We're not murderers. We're not going to sacrifice one of us to some—" His outburst sparked a heated debate. Kai argued that we needed to appease the spirit to have any chance of survival. Zoe tearfully suggested we draw straws to make it fair. I remained silent, torn between the instinct for self-preservation and the horror of what we were considering. As our arguments grew more intense, the RV began to change around us. The rust spread visibly, eating away at the metal. Roots burst through the floor, twisting and writhing like living things. The message on the wall pulsed with an eerie light, a constant reminder of our grim choice. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to take its toll. Our discussions turned circular, tempers flared, and paranoia set in. Every rustle outside made us jump, convinced the spirit was coming to claim its prize. It was Kai who finally broke. "I'll do it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the constant whispers of the forest. "I'll stay behind." We all stared at him in shock.
Kai, no, I began, but he held up a hand to stop me.
Think about it. I'm the one who knows the most about this spirit, about the legends. Maybe I can find a way to appease it, to end this cycle, and if not, he swallowed hard. At least the rest of you will have a chance to live. The silence that followed was devastating. Part of me wanted to argue, to insist we find another way, but another part, a part I wasn't proud of, felt relief. Relief that it wouldn't be me. Relief that we might finally escape this nightmare. Liam was the first to speak. "We can't ask you to do this, man. It's not right." Kai managed a weak smile. "You're not asking, I'm offering. Please, let me do this one good thing." As dawn broke, casting sickly green light through the warped windows of the RV, we made our preparations. Kai gave us his research notes, making us promise to share what had happened here, to warn others. We embraced him, tears flowing freely, the weight of what we were about to do settling over us like a shroud. When we stepped outside, the forest had changed once more. A clear path stretched before us, leading away from the twisted RV and Kai. The whistle had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence. "Go," Kai said, his voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "Don't look back." With heavy hearts, we began to walk. I fought the urge to turn around, to take one last look at our friend. But I knew if I did, I might not have the strength to leave. As we followed the path, the oppressive atmosphere of the grove began to lift. The trees thinned out, and I could see glimpses of blue sky above. Hope, fragile but persistent, began to bloom in my chest. And then we heard it. A scream. Distant but unmistakably Kai's. Filled with terror and pain. It cut off abruptly, leaving a silence more horrifying than any sound. We ran then, our feet pounding against the earth, driven by fear and guilt and the desperate need to escape. The path seemed endless, but finally, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line. The ranger station stood before us, solid and real. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, unable to believe we had actually made it out. But as park rangers rushed to our aid, peppering us with questions we couldn't begin to answer, I knew the truth. We might have escaped the grove, but we would never truly leave it behind. The choice we made, the friend we left behind, these things would haunt us for the rest of our lives. And somewhere in the depths of Mariposa Grove, among the ancient sequoias, a spirit waited for the next group of unsuspecting hikers to wander too far off the path. to become ensnared in its ancient, terrible game. The nightmare might be over for us, but for others it was only a matter of time before it began anew. The days following our escape from Mariposa Grove passed in a blur of police interviews, medical examinations, and frantic calls from worried family members. We told our story countless times, first to the park rangers, then to local law enforcement, and finally to a pair of stone-faced FBI agents who listened with barely concealed skepticism. No one believed us, of course. How could they? Our tale of an ancient vengeful spirit and a friend willingly sacrificed sounded like the ravings of trauma-induced madness. The official report listed Kai as missing, presumed dead from exposure or animal attack. Search parties combed the grove but found no trace of him or the twisted RV we described. Liam, Zoe, and I clung to each other in those early days, bound by our shared experience and the weight of our terrible secret. But as time passed, the strain began to show. Zoe retreated into herself, barely speaking and jumping at every sudden noise. Liam threw himself into planning search expeditions, convinced we could still save Kai if we just tried hard enough. I found myself caught in the middle, torn between the need to move on and the guilt that gnawed at me day and night. The memory of Kai's final scream haunted my dreams, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had left him to a fate worse than death. A month after our return, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen. Kai's journal lay open beside me, filled with his meticulous notes on the legends of Mariposa Grove. We had promised to share his research, to warn others of the danger lurking in those ancient woods. But every time I tried to write, the words failed me. How could I possibly convey the horror of what we had experienced? How could I make anyone understand the choice we had been forced to make? A soft knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Liam standing there, looking haggard and unkempt. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "Can I come in?" I nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. We sat on the couch, an uncomfortable silence stretching between us. Finally, Liam spoke. "I'm leaving tomorrow, going back to the Grove." My heart clenched with fear. "Liam, no, you can't go back there. It's too dangerous." He shook his head, a determined glint in his eye. "I have to, Maya. We left Kai behind. We have to make it right." "There's nothing to make right," I insisted, even as guilt churned in my stomach. "We did what we had to do to survive. Kai made his choice." "Did he?" Liam challenged. "Or did we make it for him? We could have found another way if we'd just tried harder." I wanted to argue, to make him see reason, but I knew it was pointless. The Grove had its hooks in him, just as it did in all of us. "What about Zoe?" I asked instead. Liam's expression softened slightly. "She's going to stay with our parents for a while. I think she needs professional help to deal with all this." I nodded, relieved that at least one of us was getting the support we so desperately needed. "Will you come with me?" Liam asked suddenly, hope flaring in his eyes. "Back to the Grove? We stand a better chance together." For a moment I was tempted. The pull of the Grove was strong, the need for answers, for closure, almost overwhelming. But then I remembered the terror, the hopelessness, the soul-crushing decisions we had been forced to make. "I can't," I said softly. "I'm sorry, Liam, but I can't go back there. Not ever." Disappointment and something darker flashed across his face. "I understand," he said, but I could hear the lie in his voice. We talked for a while longer, reminiscing about happier times, carefully avoiding any mention of our fateful trip. When Liam finally left, I knew with a painful certainty that it would be the last time I ever saw him. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail from Zoe. Liam had never made it to his hotel near Yosemite. His car had been found abandoned at the Mariposa Grove trailhead, a single set of footprints leading into the forest. As I listened to Zoe's tearful message, I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that Liam would never be found. The Grove had reclaimed him, just as it had Kai. In that moment I made a decision. I opened my laptop and began to write. I poured out our story, every terrifying detail, every impossible choice. I included Kai's research, his warnings about the ancient spirit that guarded the sequoias. I wrote of the price we paid for our survival, of the friends we lost and the guilt we would carry forever. And I wrote a warning to anyone who might stumble upon this tale. Stay on the marked paths. Respect the ancient trees. And if you hear a whistle in the depths of Mariposa Grove, run, and don't look back. As I typed the final words, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't bring back those we had lost, but I could honor Kai's final wish. I could try to prevent others from suffering our fate. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I'm not sure I would if I hadn't lived through it myself, but I know the truth. And somewhere in the heart of Mariposa Grove, among the towering sequoias that have stood watch for millennia, an ancient spirit waits and hungers, and remembers. 5 years have passed since that fateful trip to Mariposa Grove. 5 years of nightmares, therapy sessions, and trying to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I published our story online, as I promised I would, but it was met with the expected mix of disbelief, ridicule, and accusations of attention-seeking. Zoe and I stayed in touch, bonded by our shared trauma. She never fully recovered from the experience, but with time and professional help, she learned to cope. We meet for coffee every few months, careful to steer our conversations away from the past we'd rather forget. I thought I had put it all behind me. I moved to a new city, started a new job, even began dating again, but the Grove was never far from my thoughts. It was a crisp autumn morning when I received the email. The subject line read, "Mariposa Grove, urgent." My hand trembled as I clicked to open it. The message was brief, sent from an anonymous email address. "Miss Lopez, I've read your account of what happened in Mariposa Grove. I believe you, because the same thing is happening again. Please, we need your help. Meet me at the Yosemite Visitor Center this Saturday at 10 a.m. You're our only hope. Jay." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to delete the email, to pretend I'd never seen it, but I knew I couldn't. The guilt I'd carried for 5 years wouldn't let me. I booked a flight that same day. As I write this final entry, I'm sitting in a small motel room just outside Yosemite National Park. Tomorrow I'll meet this mysterious Jay and find out what's happening in Mariposa Grove. I don't know what I'll discover. I don't know if I'll be able to help or if I'm walking into another nightmare. But I do know this. I can't let what happened to Kai and Liam happen to anyone else. If there's even a chance I can prevent more lives from being lost to the spirit of the Grove, I have to try. To anyone reading this, if I don't return, know that I went willingly, and please, heed my warning. Stay on the marked paths, respect the ancient trees. And if you hear a whistle in the depths of Mariposa Grove, run, and don't look back. For those we lost, and those we might yet save. Maya Lopez. The laptop screen flickered, casting eerie shadows in the dimly lit motel room. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of a familiar haunting melody. In Mariposa Grove, ancient sequoias stood silent sentinel, their massive trunks hiding secrets older than human memory. And deep within the heart of the forest, something stirred, awakening once more to the presence of those who dared to challenge its domain. The cycle was beginning anew, the spirit's hunger undiminished by the passage of time. As a new group of unsuspecting visitors entered the grove, drawn by curiosity and the allure of the unknown, the whistle began again, soft at first, then growing stronger. The nightmare that Maya, Liam, Zoe, and Kai had endured was not over. It was perhaps only the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying story, one that would continue to unfold in the shadows of Mariposa Grove for years to come.